Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Sexting. Okay. If you don't know this word, you probably know the practice. It just means sending a sexual image or text message to another person, often via a mobile phone. And there's been a big panic about sexting in a number of countries, especially the US. The main concern is that these very private images could be publicly distributed. And of course, this is a big problem. And in the 10 years that I've been studying this panic about sexting in the US, one thing that just has not changed at all in all of that time is that everyone seems to think they have the solution to this problem of privacy violations. It's so simple, people tell me. Just don't sext. It's easy. Okay, that's a good choice for a lot of people. However, a lot of you are still deciding to trust your partners and sext. In every study I've seen, more than 50% of young adults are sexting. And I even saw one that said people over 50 years old, the rate was about a quarter. So people are sexting. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, because with every new communication technology, one of the first things we do with it is use it to talk about and represent sexuality. We've had Polaroids, love letters, phone sex. It shouldn't be a surprise. And of course, sexting is risky, but like anything that's kind of fun, it should be consensual, even though there are these risks attached. What I think is a serious problem is, of course, sharing without consent. This is a serious breach of trust. So why do these privacy violations happen? And the question I want to think about right now is, can design help us prevent them? Is that even possible? So with protecting privacy, we have to think about how do we control information. And there's kind of an interesting contradiction in how we think about this. On the one hand, we have copyright. Everyone seems to agree that basically we should control information that's commercially produced to generate a profit, like a TV show or an album. We have patent laws, we have intellectual property laws, there's lawsuits about copyright all the time. So we have a lot of support for this idea that profit is a good reason to control information. But on the other hand, we also hear information wants to be free. And especially in the early web, we had this wonderful idea that maybe if we could find a way to make the internet impossible to control, it's inherently impossible to regulate, that we would have this perfect free market, we would have no monopolies online, that we would have this robust political discourse, and that we would have global connectedness and world peace. And we thought all this about the telegraph when it was new as well. And this idea that information wants to be free, it seems on the surface sort of like a progressive anti-censorship idea. It seems good. But the problem is, if you buy into this, then it's easy to just assume that digital privacy is just completely impossible. And if we go with that, then it totally makes sense that Google and Facebook, et cetera, they can all collect our private data and do whatever they want with it. We also have this acceptance of data mining, of state surveillance, and a lot of people respond to these problems and they say, well, we've just given up on digital privacy, so just forget about it. There's nothing we can do. But the thing is, we haven't actually given up on digital privacy at all. We have norms and laws and policies that protect our digital privacy. And the thing is, it doesn't matter if information is digital or not. We know if it's supposed to be private. If you have a doctor and you have a health issue, your records are going to be all digitized, but the doctor can't just distribute those records. If you text your best friend and you tell them about some embarrassing health problem, they're probably not going to just share that with everyone. That would be a violation of medical ethics, of policies, or of the best friend code. So this advice that I keep hearing, just don't sext, it only makes sense if we buy into this idea that digital privacy is just impossible and that all sexts will just be distributed. The problem with this advice is that if it's the only thing we say, then it really implies that if a privacy violation happens, then everyone is equally guilty and equally responsible. It implies that the person who created the image and sent it consensually is just as guilty as the person who took that private image and distributed it without permission. And laws do this as well. In the US, we have these child pornography laws, and they apply equally to any teen that's involved in sexting. It doesn't matter if they're sexting consensually or if they're taking a private image and sharing it to dozens of people without permission. They've all committed the same crime of child pornography. And we also have some laws that protect adults' privacy, but at the same time, I hear stories of people going to police and saying, you know, my images are online, what can I do? And the police will look at them and say, you really shouldn't have sent that image out. Oh, too bad. This is called victim blaming. And it's as if we think that the punishment for creating an image of yourself and trusting someone with it is that you deserve to have your image just distributed online everywhere. And so when we're telling victims that it's equally their fault, we're saying that trusting someone is the same thing as deliberately harming them. It doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like saying to someone, well, if you don't want to get cheated on, then you shouldn't get into a monogamous relationship. And this advice, just don't sext, it seems gender neutral, but it's really not, because we know that women and girls are much more likely to get slut-shamed and harassed if they experience one of these privacy violations. And maybe you can't get worked up about digital privacy because you think, well, you know, I have nothing to hide. But if you've ever used a password or an envelope or a bathroom door, then I think you have some sense of how important and valuable privacy is. So I think we need to advocate for better laws. I think we need to do a better job of respecting one another's privacy. But what I want to focus on right now is how I think designers can help us focus more on privacy. I think what we all need to do is think more about consent. And if we apply consent to private information, what that means is that before anyone can distribute and publish any information that might be private, they should have to get your permission. And this means completely rethinking all of our defaults in social media, because with every social platform, we're encouraged to share, repost, forward, distribute everything. That's how it works. Instead, I think that default should be, you need to get my permission before you can share my content. And that permission needs to be meaningful, it needs to be voluntary, and it needs to be explicit. And you know, we already have models for this in other situations where we have a high risk of harm, like a medical procedure. When you go in for surgery, you have very strict rules about informed consent. And maybe we don't need to go that far, but the models are there. Consent also works in the other direction. You shouldn't ever send a sexual image to someone unless you're really certain they want to receive it. And if you're wondering, how do I know? Just ask. I think you'll get an answer if you ask someone this. It's easy. Okay, so if we add consent to how we think about the flows of information, this means, I think, we can change people's actions and we can change how people think about privacy. I think design, of course, has this power to shift our defaults. I really think it's possible that good design can help us respect privacy and pay a lot more attention to consent. Now, of course, no new app is going to solve some deeply entrenched and complex social problem, but I do think that technology can shape our behavior. It can nudge us in one direction or the other, especially when we're not thinking about it too much. I want to give you an example. Here's this park that's by my house, and you can see it has this nice curved path, which looks great on a satellite image. However, people want to take the shortest route across the park, so they walk through the grass, and they wear this little path in the grass. And the city wanted to keep the grass. So what they did was they put up a sign. The sign did not work. People just went right around that sign, and the grass continued to be damaged. So what they did next was they put up a fence. And it's a low fence, but you know what? It worked. People followed the pavement and stayed off the grass, and the city got their grass back. My point here is not about ill-advised urban planning decisions. The point is that this really low fence, which is super easy to just step right over, that was enough. That low barrier was enough to prevent most people from walking on the grass. And like this fence, I think technology companies and designers can make choices that help us protect privacy. Because right now, everything is set up for maximum sharing, maximum distribution. But instead, what if we gave users more control? We already have digital rights management systems for copyright. Like if you get an ebook, there's DRM on it. You can't just send it to anyone you want without restrictions. So we could borrow those DRM systems and we could add them to user platforms, right? So at the point of creation, when you take your camera and you take a photo of something, you should be able to decide, can this image be distributed to others or not? We could also add this when we think about social media apps at the point of distribution. We can add these tools for users. Because if you create something, why shouldn't you be able to decide if this is forwardable or not? What if everything was unforwardable by default, and you could just click a little box if you wanted all your friends to be able to forward it? But if you didn't, don't click that box. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. DRM is hackable. Of course it is. People can jump over the fence, or they can just run right through it. And especially with nude images, some people are going to be malicious and determined, and they are going to step over that fence. So there is no technology on the planet that is going to stop the malicious, determined privacy violator who really wants to harm and humiliate someone. But if you have to step outside the app, if you have to do something that goes over that fence in some way, that means you have to be more deliberate and you have to be more willful in how you're harming someone. Because I like to think that most people are not just vicious jerks, that these people who are sending out private images without permission, that they just weren't thinking about it. And I actually saw a study recently that said 3/4 of people who had sent out a private image said they regretted it, and they wouldn't have done it if they had thought more about it or if they had realized how much it was going to harm someone. So I think those people, those 75%, we can nudge their behavior towards more ethical if we build in some of these fences. So I think designers have a big responsibility. I think the choices they make really influence how people act. And we can have them do this on their own, and some of them are, and that's fantastic. We can also compel them as users. We can advocate for policies that say, you have to build fences like this into the things that we use every day. Some designers, of course, are doing this, and that's great. But most companies end up scrambling after the fact to deal with the harm that their products and apps and platforms are causing. And so instead, what I want to encourage everyone who creates something that others use is to ask yourself some important questions at the very earliest phases of when you are creating and developing and designing something. How could users have more control over their content? How could users have more input into how their content is distributed? And crucially, think through, how can someone use the thing that I'm creating to harm or harass other people? Because it's going to happen. And then the very key question is, once we identify that, how could we build in some low fences in this app that might make that harm a little bit harder to accomplish? What I'm suggesting is that the distribution of all of our content shouldn't be as frictionless as it currently is. And there is a cost in the short term. Your app or product may have fewer minutes of engagement, fewer clicks, and you may have to pay a human content moderator. But what does it say about your company if you don't care about what your clicks are doing, if your clicks are harming others? What does it say if it looks like you don't care? So I think if you design for consent in the long term, what you'll have is users more likely to stick around. Because if you give them control over their content, I think they'll feel safer. And in the end, you might actually earn their trust. Thank you.